The eviction notice was taped to the door with blue painter's tape. Pale blue. Almost cheerful. Miriam Holt stood in the hallway of the apartment building she had lived in for 11 years. Still wearing her house slippers, the worn beige ones with the fraying left strap, holding a paper grocery bag against her chest. Inside the bag, a carton of eggs, a small loaf of bread, and a birthday card she had bought for her neighbor Gloria but never delivered. She was 72 years old. The notice said she had 14 days. But her landlord, a man named Derek who wore cologne that arrived before he did, had already changed the lock while she was at the pharmacy. She had $2.17 in her purse. A transit card with no balance. A cell phone that couldn't receive calls because the bill hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just stood there in the fluorescent light of the hallway, that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes everyone look slightly ill, and read the notice twice. Then she folded it neatly in quarters, like it was something worth keeping, and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. She had nowhere to go. But Miriam Holt had survived things before. Things that would have erased a lesser person entirely. She just didn't know that this moment, this brutal, humiliating, lonely moment, was actually the beginning of something she had been waiting 72 years to find. Miriam had been a school librarian for 31 years in a small district in rural Vermont. Not a glamorous career. Not a wealthy one. But she had loved it with the quiet, unshakable devotion of someone who understood that books weren't just paper, they were lifeboats. She had watched hundreds of children discover themselves between the covers of stories, and that had felt like enough. When she retired at 64, she had a modest pension, a small savings account, and a one-bedroom apartment in Burlington she could manage. Her husband, Edmund, had died 8 years earlier from a stroke. They had never had children, not for lack of trying, but eventually they had made peace with it, and built a life that was full in other ways. Dinners with friends. Long drives through the autumn hills. Edmund's terrible jokes that she had secretly found hilarious. After Edmund died, Miriam learned something nobody tells you about grief: it doesn't come all at once. It arrives in installments. Sometimes it waits years before sending its heaviest packages. By the time she was 70, 2 things had happened that cracked the foundation of her careful retirement. First, a medical crisis. A fall down a short flight of stairs, just 4 steps, nothing dramatic, had resulted in a shattered hip that required 2 surgeries, 6 weeks of rehabilitation. And costs that ate through her savings like fire through paper. Insurance covered portions. Enough to feel grateful. Not enough to feel safe. Second, and quietly, loneliness. The compound, cellular kind that doesn't announce itself but simply accumulates. Her friends, the women she had lunch with, the retired teachers she had known for decades, moved away, or got sick, or died. Gloria, her neighbor, developed dementia and moved to a memory care facility. The world contracted. She started selling things. Small things first. Edmund's cufflinks. A set of china she'd never used. Then larger things. A camera. A sewing machine. Her car, eventually, which meant she was dependent on buses and the occasional kindness of strangers. By 72, her pension, which had seemed reasonable at 64, could no longer keep up with rent increases that had doubled in 3 years. She had spoken to Derek about it twice. He had smiled both times and said he'd see what he could do. He had changed the lock while she was getting her blood pressure medication. So there she was. Hallway. Slippers. Blue tape. $2.17. She called her only living relative, a nephew named Curtis in Phoenix, from a pay phone she found outside a gas station 2 blocks away. The call cost her $1.50. Curtis answered on the 4th ring, distracted, the sound of a television in the background. When she explained what had happened, there was a long pause. "Aunt Miriam, things are really tight right now. We've got the kids and the mortgage and—" His voice trailed off. "Maybe you could look into some kind of assistance program?" She thanked him. She didn't make him feel guilty. She had never been that kind of woman. She walked to a community center and sat in the lobby for 3 hours, nursing a cup of coffee someone gave her without being asked. A social worker named Patricia gave her a list of shelters, several pamphlets, and a look of genuine sympathy that Miriam appreciated even as it stung. That night, she slept in the community center's anteroom, curled in a chair, her grocery bag on her lap. She had 67 cents to her name. And somewhere in the back of her mind, very far back, almost forgotten, something stirred. A memory. Not clear yet. Just a feeling. Like a door she hadn't thought about in decades. The memory surfaced at 3:14 in the morning, in the greenish quiet of a room that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. Her mother. Eleanor Holt had died when Miriam was 51, 21 years ago now. She had been a strange, private woman. Not cold, exactly, but contained. The kind of person who held her interior life the way you hold a candle in wind, carefully, close to the body, blocking it from the elements. Eleanor had grown up in Cavendish, Vermont. A town so small it barely registered on most maps. She had left at 18 and rarely gone back. She had never explained why, and Miriam, who had inherited her mother's tendency toward not asking painful questions, had never pushed. At the estate settlement after Eleanor's death, there had been almost nothing. A small savings account. Some furniture. A storage unit with boxes of photographs and old clothing. And a deed. To a property in Cavendish. A small cottage on roughly 2 acres at the edge of a forest. Miriam remembered her attorney at the time, a young, efficient woman named Sandra, handing her the document with mild confusion. "This has been in your mother's name for decades. It's yours now. I'd suggest visiting it before you decide what to do with it." Miriam had intended to. Then Edmund had his stroke 3 months later, and the cottage had gone into a drawer in her mind labeled later, and later had become eventually, and eventually had become never. She sat up in the dark community center chair with sudden, startling clarity. The cottage. Was it still there? Had taxes been paid? She tried to remember, she had set up an automatic property tax payment from her bank account back when she had money in it. Had that continued? She wasn't sure. She honestly wasn't sure. But she had nowhere else to go. In the morning, she asked Patricia at the social worker's desk if she could use the office computer. Patricia said yes. Miriam searched the Cavendish County property records. It took her 40 minutes and 3 frustrated restarts, and found it. Miriam Eleanor Holt. The property was still registered in her name. And the tax records showed payments had been made. The automatic transfer, it seemed, had run quietly in the background for 21 years like a loyal, forgotten servant. She felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief. Not relief. Something more complicated. Something that required a different word than she currently had. Patricia helped her find a bus route. It would take 2 transfers and a 5-mile walk. The walk was the problem, her hip. A volunteer at the center, a man named Harold who was probably 65 himself and had the quiet competence of a former soldier, offered to drive her. "I'm going that direction anyway," he said. It was obvious he wasn't, but Miriam didn't argue. They drove mostly in silence. Harold didn't ask questions. She was grateful. The address led them down a gravel road that disappeared into trees, and then curved gently, and then, there. The cottage. It was smaller than she remembered from the deed description. White paint, gone gray. A porch that sagged at the center like it had been exhaling slowly for years. Shutters on the windows. All of them sealed shut. A door with no visible lock, just a latch, the old kind, with a rusted lever. It looked like a place that had been waiting. Miriam got out of Harold's car and walked up the path slowly, her cane pressing into the soft ground. The air smelled like pine and cold soil and something she couldn't name, something old and damp and oddly familiar. She lifted the latch. The door opened. Inside, darkness, dust, the shapes of furniture covered in white sheets. The smell of sealed air, of decades held in a closed space. Cold but dry. The structure was sound. The roof had held. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Harold, from the car, called out gently, "You okay?" "Yes," she said. And then, for the first time in what felt like months, that was actually true. The first week was brutal. There was no electricity. The water came from a well with a hand pump in the yard that groaned and resisted before finally, reluctantly, giving water. The water was clean, she had it tested by driving a sample to a local pharmacy in town, but cold. Profoundly cold. There was no heat except a small wood-burning stove in the main room. Miriam had never used a wood stove in her life. Her first attempts produced mostly smoke and a lot of coughing. She burned her hand on the grate. She sat on the cold floor, her burned hand wrapped in a damp cloth, and had the full-bodied cry she had been holding back for days. Not a quiet cry. An ugly one. The kind that doubles you over. She cried for Edmund. For the apartment. For Curtis's distracted voice. For the beige slippers she'd left in the hallway because she'd had no hands to carry them. For the birthday card she'd never given Gloria. For the years she'd meant to visit this cottage and hadn't. When she was done, she felt scraped hollow but somehow lighter. Like a jar that's been emptied and cleaned. She figured out the stove on the third day, with the help of a YouTube video she watched at the Cavendish Public Library on a borrowed tablet. The librarian, a young woman named Sophie who had the kind of patient efficiency Miriam recognized in herself at that age, showed her how to connect to the Wi-Fi and then tactfully left her alone. The cottage had no bed. She slept on a cot she found in a back room, under 4 layers of found blankets. She ate oatmeal, which was cheap and required only hot water. She ate eggs she bought from a farm stand 2 miles down the road, where the farmer's wife gave her 3 extra for free and didn't comment on Miriam's circumstances. Small mercies. She collected them like stones. The physical discomfort was manageable. What was harder was the silence. In Burlington, there had been noise, traffic, pipes, the murmur of neighbors. Here, at night, there was almost nothing. Just wind in the trees and occasionally an animal sound she couldn't identify. In that silence, her own thoughts became very loud. What are you doing? You're 72. You have a bad hip. It's November. What is the actual plan here? She didn't have an answer. Not a complete one. But she started exploring the cottage more carefully in those first 2 weeks. Pulling the sheets off the furniture. Opening drawers. The furniture was old and solid, handmade, some of it. The kind of craftsmanship that assumed permanence. She found a rocking chair that was more comfortable than anything she'd sat in for years. She found a cast iron skillet, seasoned beautifully, that she recognized it. She had seen her mother cook with one just like it. She found books. Dozens of them, on a built-in shelf in the small hallway. Old books. Well-read books. Spines creased with intention. She ran her fingers across them in the early morning light, reading names: Willa Cather, John Steinbeck, Edna St. Vincent Millay. Books her mother had loved. But what she found in the third week changed everything. In the back bedroom, the smaller one, which she'd assumed was a storage space, behind a wardrobe that took her 20 minutes and considerable hip discomfort to move, there was a door. Not a large door. Roughly 4 feet high. Sealed with 3 sliding bolts and a small padlock. She stood in front of it for a long time. The padlock was old but not rusted. Which meant, somehow, it had been maintained. Or was simply quality hardware. She searched the cottage. Every drawer, every tin, every pocket of every coat hanging in the front closet. She found a small key in an envelope taped to the underside of the kitchen table. The envelope had no writing on it. The key fit the padlock. The space beyond the small door was a room. Barely large enough to stand in. Maybe 8 feet by 10. A single small window, also shuttered, that let in a narrow line of light when Miriam pushed the shutter open. What the room contained, she had to sit down. On the floor. Her bad hip protesting, but she sat anyway, because her legs had simply decided they were done standing. The room was a studio. Her mother's studio. The walls were hung with paintings. Dozens of them. Some framed, some stretched on canvas, some just paper, pinned directly to the wood. Landscapes, mostly. Vermont landscapes, the specific golden green of September hillsides, the blue of mountain ridgelines in winter, the brown-silver of rivers in early spring. They were technically accomplished. More than accomplished. They were extraordinary. Her mother had never mentioned she could paint. Not once. In 51 years of Miriam's life, Eleanor Holt had never said a word about it. Miriam sat on the floor of that small room and looked at a world her mother had kept entirely secret, and something inside her, some sealed, bolted thing, came open. Why? Why had she never shown anyone? Why had she hidden this? In the corner, there was a small wooden box. Inside, journals. Thin notebooks, dozens of them, dated over 35 years. The earliest one was from 1959. Eleanor would have been 23. Miriam opened the first one with hands that were not quite steady. The handwriting was small and very controlled, her mother's handwriting exactly, the way she used to address envelopes. Miriam read for hours. The light moved across the floor as the afternoon aged. She didn't notice. The story that emerged from those pages was not the story Miriam thought she knew. Her mother had been, in her 20s, an art student. She had been talented enough to attract serious attention. But she had come from a family, Miriam's grandfather, a man she had barely known, who believed that artistic ambition in women was a form of vanity. A form of selfishness. He had made her life very small. He had made her believe that wanting things for yourself was something to be ashamed of. So Eleanor had hidden it. She had painted in secret for 35 years. In this cottage, which she had purchased with money she'd saved, coin by coin, year by year, from the household budget. A space that was only hers. A life that was only hers. And then, in the last journal, a final entry dated 18 months before Eleanor's death, Miri will find this someday. I didn't know how to show her while I was alive. I didn't know how to be that brave. But I hope she understands, it's not enough to survive. You have to insist on yourself. Even if the world made you believe that was wrong. Even if you're old. Even at the very end. Insist. Miriam read the word Miri, her childhood nickname. The one only her mother had used, and she put the journal down on her knee and looked at the paintings around her and said nothing for a very long time. The light through the small window turned from gold to amber to the flat gray of evening. Then she got up. Slowly. With effort. And she looked at one of the paintings, a hillside in October, the trees a burning orange red, and she looked at it the way you look at something when you understand, finally, what you're seeing. Not a secret. A gift. Her mother had been leaving her this her entire life. Waiting for the moment when Miriam would need it most. Miriam spent the next 6 weeks reading all of the journals. Not in one sitting, her eyes weren't what they were. An hour or two each day, in the rocking chair by the stove, a blanket across her knees. She read her mother's life the way you read a novel you know is going to break your heart, slowly, because you want it to last. And she began to understand things. About Eleanor. About herself. About the quiet, inherited belief, passed down like a recessive gene, that a woman's needs were secondary. That wanting space for yourself was an imposition on others. That surviving was enough. That it had to be enough. Miriam thought about her 31 years as a librarian. She had loved it. She didn't regret it. But she also thought, honestly, perhaps for the first time, about what she had quietly surrendered over decades. Not dramatically. Not in any single defining moment. Just incrementally. The way glaciers move. The way water carves stone. She had been a woman who made herself comfortable for others to be around. And now she was 72, alone, in a cold cottage, and no one was watching. So she decided, with the same quiet precision her mother had used to save coins for this property, to insist on herself. She contacted a gallery in Woodstock, not in person, because the drive was long and her hips still limited her, but by letter. She described the paintings. She asked if someone could come and look at them. The gallery owner, a man named Garrett, came 2 weeks later and stood in that small room for 45 minutes without speaking. When he came out, his face was careful. Professional. But his eyes weren't. "These are remarkable," he said. "Do you know if any of them were ever exhibited?" "No," Miriam said. "No one knew they existed." He turned to look at her. "What do you want to do with them?" She thought about her mother's last journal entry. "Insist. I want people to see them," she said. "I want my mother to finally be seen." The exhibition took 4 months to organize. Miriam worked with Garrett and a colleague of his, a woman who specialized in posthumous works. The process was meticulous and sometimes overwhelming: authentication, provenance documentation, the gentle restoration of several paintings that had suffered minor moisture damage. Miriam learned more about art conservation in 4 months than she had known in 72 years. She also learned to drive the truck she found in the cottage's small shed, a 1987 pickup that, improbably, started after a new battery and a mechanic's visit. Harold drove her for the first month. Then she drove herself. Her hip hurt. She drove anyway. She started painting. Not because she thought she was talented. Not with any particular ambition. She started because she had found, in her mother's supply box at the back of the studio, 6 untouched tubes of paint and 3 unused brushes. And it seemed wrong to waste them. She was not her mother. Her early attempts were clumsy and almost comically bad, the proportions wrong, the colors muddy. She laughed at them. That surprised her, the laughing. She hadn't expected to find things funny. She painted the view from the cottage's front porch at different times of day. She painted the hand pump in the yard. She painted the rocking chair. She painted her own hands, old hands, with their visible veins and the small scar from the stove grate. Sophie from the library started stopping by occasionally, ostensibly to bring Miriam books she'd requested, but really, Miriam understood. Because Sophie was young and somewhat lonely in a small town and Miriam made good coffee and was interesting to talk to. This arrangement suited both of them perfectly. Garrett sold the first 2 of Eleanor's paintings in December. The sale price was not enormous, but it was enough for Miriam to have the cottage's electrical wiring restored and a small heating system installed. The night she turned the heat on for the first time, she stood in the center of the main room and felt warm air move across her face. And she pressed both hands flat against her cheeks and felt the warmth against her palms, and she thought, "I am still here. I am still here and I am warm." It was, she decided, a sufficient miracle. The exhibition opened in March. It was a Thursday evening. The gallery was warm and smelled of wine and wood smoke from a fireplace. The paintings were hung on white walls under directed light that made them glow with an intensity they'd never had in the small shuttered room where they'd spent 3 decades. Miriam wore a blue dress she'd found at a consignment shop in town. Navy blue, simply cut. The kind of dress that doesn't call attention to itself but doesn't apologize either. She stood near the entrance and watched people look at her mother's work. A woman in her 40s stood in front of the October hillside painting, the one Miriam had looked at on the floor of the studio, for nearly 10 minutes. When she finally turned away, her eyes were bright. She didn't see Miriam watching. An elderly man spent a long time with a Winter River painting, his head slightly tilted. Then he put one hand on the wall, not touching the painting, just near it, and breathed. Miriam watched this and understood something she had not expected to understand. Art does not die when it's hidden. It waits. And the people who need it, they find it. Maybe not in the moment it was made. Maybe decades later. But they find it. She was thinking about this when Garrett appeared at her elbow and introduced her to a woman named Dr. Vera Ashworth, a professor of art history from the University of Vermont, who wanted to discuss Eleanor's work for a paper she was writing on unexhibited women artists of the 20th century. Vera was brisk and brilliant and spoke very fast. But she paused, mid-sentence, and looked at Miriam directly, and said, "You didn't know she could paint?" "No," Miriam said. Vera was quiet for a moment. "Then, that must have been strange. Discovering that your mother had this entire interior world you didn't know about." "Yes," Miriam said. "But also..." She stopped. Searched for the right word. "Also," she continued, "it made me wonder what world she saw in me that I never showed her." Vera looked at her for a long moment. "That's the question, isn't it?" That night, driving home in the pickup truck, the heater working perfectly now, the road dark and the trees thick on either side. The cold March stars visible through the windshield, Miriam thought about that question. She thought about the journals. About the 35 years of secret paintings. About a woman who had been told, in 1,000 small ways, that her inner life didn't matter, and who had responded not by surrendering it but by making it smaller and more protected. A fire kept alive in a sealed room. And she thought about herself. About the person she had been before this, careful, accommodating, making herself easy. Taking up only the space she was given. And she thought, this is the part that arrived slowly, like light through a shutter, that perhaps the eviction, the $2, the locked cottage, the secret room, perhaps none of it was simply disaster. Perhaps it had been a kind of inheritance. Not of property. Not of paintings. But of permission. Her mother had not known how to give Miriam that permission while alive. She had been too sealed herself. But she had left it here, in this cottage, in these journals. In the brushstrokes of 35 years of insistence, waiting for the moment when Miriam would have nothing left to lose and would finally, be willing to receive it. The cottage had not been a refuge. It had been an assignment. Spring came. The porch had been repaired, Harold and a friend had spent 2 weekends on it, refusing payment. Accepting coffee and Miriam's particular brand of straight-faced dry humor that made Harold's friend nearly choke on his sandwich. The sagging center board was gone. The porch was level and strong. Miriam put the rocking chair on it. She painted in the mornings, when the light came through the trees at a low angle and made everything look like it was lit from within. She was still not particularly good. But she was becoming less bad, which felt like its own kind of progress. Eleanor's work continued to attract attention. A small museum in Burlington acquired 3 pieces. Vera's paper was published and referenced Eleanor Holt as an example of the systemic suppression of women's artistic voices in mid-century America. A sentence in the paper mentioned Miriam's discovery of the studio. Several people wrote to Miriam after it was published. Letters, actual paper letters, which she read at the kitchen table with her coffee. One letter was from a woman in her 80s in Oregon who wrote, "I have a box under my bed that I haven't opened in 40 years. Your story made me think I should open it." Miriam wrote back. She told the woman, "Open it. It's not too late. It is almost certainly not too late." She thought about Curtis sometimes. She didn't call him. Not out of bitterness, she had made her peace with that conversation in the way she made peace with most things, slowly and honestly and without pretending it was something other than what it was. She simply found that she had less need to explain herself to people who didn't have the capacity to understand. She needed less, generally. This surprised her. Not fewer things, she had the cottage now, and warmth, and a truck, and coffee in good quantity. But she needed less approval. Less validation. Less of the invisible scaffolding she had constructed over 70 years to make other people comfortable with her existence. She existed now on her own terms. At 72. After everything. Which raised a question she sat with often, in the rocking chair, watching the light change on the hillside that looked exactly like one of her mother's paintings. What would her life have looked like if she'd opened this door at 50? Or 40? Or 25? She didn't know. And she had stopped grieving the not knowing. Because the truth was, she had opened it when she opened it. The timing was what it was. The sealed room waited until she was ready to walk through without any soft place to retreat to. Maybe that was the only way some doors open. Not when you're ready. Not when you're strong. But when you have absolutely nothing left to protect yourself with, and you find, standing there with $2 and a grocery bag and a birthday card you never delivered, that the only direction that makes any sense is forward. Her mother had painted for 35 years in secret because she didn't believe she deserved the light. Miriam Holt was 72 years old, and she was done with the dark. She picked up her brush. The hillside was gold in the morning light. She painted it exactly as she saw it, imperfectly, lovingly, with her old hands and her shaky lines and her particular way of seeing a world she had almost stopped believing was hers. And somewhere in that small motion, in that simple act of a woman insisting on her own vision, something was finally, quietly, completely healed. The question isn't what you lost. The question is what's been waiting in the sealed room, the one you've been walking past for years, telling yourself you'll open later. How long are you willing to wait for later?